Okay, welcome to week 5 of the course. This is going to be a pretty art-heavy week. We're going to talk in this video about pottery, pottery painting, and then sculpture. And then in the next video, it'll be on architecture and architectural sculpture. And when talking about the ancient Greeks, there are a number of reasons to dwell a long time on art and architecture. For one thing, the Greeks, in many ways, helped to invent Western art as we know it. Now, as we'll see, they are certainly influenced by other art styles, so they're not completely original in every way, but they do leave a permanent imprint on Western art. So we're going to be looking at sort of Greek art from the Archaic period, so starting around the 700s BCE to the end of the Classical period, so late 300s BCE. And our main goal is not going to be, just to understand Greek art for its own sake or because it's beautiful, although all those things are valid. But Greek art is going to tell us a lot about Greek culture. And of course, it's culture that we're always primarily interested in this course. Now, I want to just remind you, in case you haven't seen this from the very beginning, that this week's essay question is on Greek sculpture. So you're going to want to pay very close attention to both this video and the next video to help you with that question. Of course, the last thing I want to do in these videos is answer that essay question for you. The question has to do with the development of Greek sculpture as we move from the Archaic period into the Classical. So I want to help you. I want to set the table for you, but I want the answer to come from your own close observation of these works. And I'll just remind you that anytime there's any week, there's any art, you can always find the art slides in PowerPoint form in that week's module. And you can really take some time with them and look at them closely. So I say that because sometimes we have to move through things rather quickly in these videos. All right, so I'm going to start with pottery, and then we'll move on to sculpture. And in both cases, both pottery and sculpture, we'll be looking first at some archaic pieces, or at least one archaic piece, and then classical. So I want to start with this work here by Exekias. Exekias was both the potter and the painter of this work. It's Achilles and Ajax playing a board game. This comes from the Archaic period. And one thing I want you to note, you can see here, is that Exekias actually signed his name on this work. Literally in Greek, this says, Exekias made it. We take that for granted today, that artists are going to sign their work, but this is something we have not seen before in the course. This is something rather new, and it suggests that the ancient Greeks in certain ways saw artists differently than some of the other ancient cultures that we've studied. In most ancient cultures, even in medieval culture, artists were seen primarily as manual laborers, which of course they were. They were seen as artisans who might be good, bad, or mediocre at their jobs, but artisans all the same. So to be put in the same class with carpenters or masons, people like that, not necessarily to be classified with, poets, that sort of thing. But the Greeks really had this more elevated notion of the artist. And we see that here with Exekias, the very fact that he was so proud of his work that he put his name on it. That suggests this more positive understanding of the artist. Okay, but back to the painting itself. So we've got Achilles on the left, we have Ajax on the right. Ajax is a figure that shows up in a number of Greek myths. We saw him in the Odyssey, actually. He's the angry Greek who refuses to talk to Odysseus. There are stories in Greek mythology, various stories about Ajax competing for Achilles' armor once Achilles died and losing that competition. And at least in one version of the story, Ajax commits suicide. So basically, Ajax was one of the least popular and regarded of Greek heroes. And what I mention all this because what Exekias has done in this painting is give us some very interesting and subtle clues that Ajax is about to lose this game to Achilles. And I think you can see this in a number of ways. First of all, you've got the fact that Achilles, particularly with his helmet on, is quite a bit taller than Ajax. Ajax is also clearly more tense than Achilles. You can see that in the fact that his right heel is slowly, just ever so slightly off the ground, whereas Achilles' heel was planted on the ground. And look at the way that they're holding their spears. So Ajax is clutching them tightly, again, as if anxious. Whereas if you look at Achilles, I'll give you a close-up there, you can see how loosely he's holding his spears. He's totally relaxed. He's confident. He's in control. He knows he is going to win. So there is some true artistry here. Now, this work is typical of the Archaic period in that this is, quite literally a black figure pottery painting. Okay, so black figure paintings were the norm during the Archaic period. If we move into the Classical period, the Classical period is normally seen as starting around 480, so at the end of the Persian Wars, and ending around the time of Alexander the Great. So let's just say 323, which is the year of Alexander's death. So the Classical period is this 150-year period from about 480 to about 330. And for a lot of people, not all, but for a lot of people, the Classical period really represents the zenith of Greek culture and civilization. And certainly a lot of the literature and philosophy and art that we're going to be looking at from the Greeks is going to come from that period. So we move into the Classical period. Here is a work right from the very beginning. I mean, technically, maybe it's even a little bit earlier than classical, but we're going to call it classical. This is an example of red figure technique, which in the Classical period really kind of supplants the black figure technique for a couple of reasons. First, just because of the way that red figure painting was created, it allowed for more precise details. Because you're actually in red figure painting, you're painting the details rather than sort of painting around them, as it were. Obviously, in some ways too, for the Greeks, the skin tones in red figure painting are more naturalistic than black figure. Red figure painting also tended to depict motion, as we can see here. Right, we can sort of get a sense that Europa is being whisked away, and a little bit more attention to anatomy and organic form. So to summarize all of this, we could say that red figure painting allowed for pottery painting to move in a more naturalistic direction. Okay, so the abduction of Europa, one example of that. Okay, that's all I want to say about pottery painting. Let's move to sort of the main event, which is Greek sculpture. And again, we're going to start in the Archaic period, and then we're going to move on into the Classical. So here is the so-called New York Kouros, called that not, of course, because it was created in New York, but because it is currently housed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Now, this is a kouros sculpture. This is not totally unique. There were many of these kouroi sculptures that were created in archaic Greece, and they either functioned as grave markers or they commemorated individuals at religious sanctuaries. And they tended to be life-size or close to life-size. This New York kouros is about 6 feet tall, so life-size. I think it might be useful to compare this sculpture with a work, not a work that we've necessarily seen before, but a work from a culture that we've studied, and that is Egyptian sculpture. Okay, so if we compare the New York kouros with, say, this sculpture of Pharaoh Menkaure, we see, I think, some very clear similarities, right? You've got a very rigid posture. You've got clenched fists. You've got the figure stepping forward with his left foot. And you also have either, some kind of headdress or, very sort of artificial looking hair. So clearly, this is just one indication of several, that Greek sculpture was influenced by Egyptian sculpture. No two ways about it. It is, I think, important, though, also to point out some differences between these two works, starting with the most obvious one, which is with the New York kouros, we have total nudity. And that was something quite unusual in ancient art, at least in ancient sculpture that was of a more naturalistic bent. Okay. And you've also got the fact that, for instance, the New York kouros is totally freestanding, whereas the Menkaure sculpture is still kind of attached to that block of stone out of which he was carved. So the ancient Greeks are borrowing from the Egyptians, but they're not borrowing in a slavish kind of way. Now, there was a kind of female counterpart to the kouros figure, and that is the kourei figure. And this is, again, one example of many. The peplos kourei. Peplos is the name of the kind of garment that this young woman is wearing. We're still in the archaic period, although we're getting towards the end of it. These figures were used as kind of votive figures. You would have one sculpted and then dedicate it to the gods or to a god or goddess. And it's not entirely clear whether this figure is supposed to represent a goddess or a worshiper of the goddess. It's hard to know for sure. Now, there are elements here of the peplos kourei that are a bit sort of abstract and artificial. Again, she's standing very stiffly. The hair is not terribly naturalistic, but there are kind of hints of organic form underneath her garment. So you can clearly sort of tell where her breasts are located. Her lips are rendered rather naturalistically. And I'll also point out, it almost looks like rust or something on her, the lower portion of her peplos. But actually, that is a remnant of paint. And it's a reminder that a lot of Greek art and sculpture specifically was originally painted in very vivid colors. So many of us, when we think about Greek art, we immediately think of, bright white marble. But in fact, so some scholars have suggested that the peplos kourei would have originally looked like that figure on the right. So I think that forces us to kind of revise some of our preconceived notions about Greek art. Okay. Well, now we're going to move into the classical period of Greek sculpture, although right at the very beginning of the classical, right? So circa 480, the Critias boy. Again, that is the very year I gave you as the beginning of the classical period. So this is early classical. And this is the original marble. Now, obviously, it's been damaged, but in a lot of cases with Greek sculpture, what we have are only Roman copies. So this is very noteworthy that this is actually the Greek marble original. Now, technically speaking, the Critias boy is an example of a Kouros figure. So belongs to the same genre as the New York Kouros, but clearly something has changed, or rather several things have changed. And again, I think we can summarize the changes under the heading of naturalism. Okay? If you look at the anatomy, again, I encourage you to compare the Critias boy with the New York Kouros and look at the way that the anatomy is rendered in both cases. What else? Well, look at the head. There's a slight kind of tilt of the head to the right. Again, suggesting life, suggesting thought, not quite as rigid, not quite as sort of lifeless as the New York Kouros. And by the way, those eye sockets, those would have originally been filled with something like a stone or marble or glass, not marble, but stone or glass, that would have really created very lifelike kinds of eyes. So let me go back. So this is sort of the beginning of this new classical age. And what I want you to do for the remaining sculptures, I'm going to go through them actually rather quickly. But here's what I want you to be thinking about when you look at these other classical works. What do they have in common? What are some of the common denominators? How do they depart from archaic sculpture? So if you're taking the New York Kouros and the Peplos Kore as your examples of archaic sculpture, how are classical sculptures moving away from that, even though in some ways they don't move all the way, entirely away from them? So as I said, you're going to want to spend some time really looking closely at these works on the PowerPoint presentation. You also have an assigned film this week, which you're going to watch in 3 parts on YouTube. That will help you as well. So very quickly, Polykletos, the spear bearer. So originally in his left hand, he would have been holding a spear. You can kind of tell that he would have been holding something there. I just want to mention 2 things about him because you've got 2 study guide terms that are both relevant to Polykletos. The first is canon. And this is an idea of Polykletos that if you want to represent human anatomy accurately, the key is getting proportions right. And so his canon was this idea that every length on the human body, so from hip to knee or from knee to ankle, is basically can be calculated in intervals. So you might take as your unit the finger or the hand, and then the length from the wrist to the elbow might be 2 hands in length. Okay, so with all the major proportions of the human body, you can kind of divide those lengths into these intervals. So that's the idea of the canon, which is another way of saying that mathematics is actually the key to getting human proportions right. The human body is mathematically intelligible. The other study guide term that I want to cite here is contrapposto. It's right there in your study guide, contrapposto, an Italian term. That refers to a kind of realistic, relaxed stance in which you are putting more of your weight on one leg thus allowing the other leg to be relaxed and bent at the knee. So obviously here with the spear bearer, the weight is on the right leg and the left leg is going to be relaxed. And again, this is another example of what we mean when we talk about naturalism in classical sculpture. Okay, very briefly. Oh, and again, if you want to sort of, if you're still struggling with contrapposto, look at the New York Kouros by way of comparison. See how rigid both of his legs are and see what a contrast that is with the spear bearer. Okay, so you're also going to be looking at Myron's discus thrower, the Poseidon and Zeus. Now, notice we don't know the name of this sculptor, but we do know the name of several of these sculptors. And again, that illustrates the fact that the Greeks really did celebrate their artists as great individuals. Finally, we have Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Cnidus. So notice that eventually, by the end of the classical period, the Greeks have gotten around to depicting the naked female form as well. There's kind of a interval between the time when they start depicting the male form and the female form, but it eventually happens. So all of these sculptures I've shown you are very much fair game to talk about in your essay. And the essay stipulates that you need to talk about at least 6 specific examples of Greek sculpture. Now, in the next video, we're going to be talking about some architectural sculptures, and those are going to be fair game as well. But you're going to want to draw heavily from these sculptures, I'm sure, in the course of answering your essay question. So I'll see you in the next video.